The wedding was moments away from beginning. Everything was perfect, the flowers arranged just right, the guests seated in silence, anticipating the moment when the music would swell and a new chapter would begin. The bride stood backstage, adjusting her veil one final time, completely unaware that in the next few minutes her carefully constructed world would collapse. But then, from the back of the chapel, a young woman walked in. She wasn't there to celebrate, she wasn't there to watch, she was there to stop everything. Her name was Victoria, and what she was about to reveal wasn't just a family scandal. What she was about to unleash was a criminal investigation that would expose years of calculated deception, stolen identities, and manipulation so deliberate, so calculated, that by the time the police arrived with their sirens screaming and their lights flashing through the church windows, everyone in that room understood one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't a wedding. This was a trap that had been carefully set for years. Before we go any deeper into this incredible story, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment down below and let us know. We read every single one, and your feedback means the world to us. And if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming documentaries. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what comes next. So here's the question nobody could answer in those first few moments of chaos. Who was the woman her father was about to marry? Where did she even come from? And most importantly, why did Victoria risk absolutely everything, her family relationships, her reputation, her peace of mind, to stop this wedding in the most public, the most shocking way possible? How did a simple wedding day transform into a full-scale criminal investigation that exposed fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, and a manipulation scheme so complex that federal agents spent months unraveling it? These are the questions that everyone was asking. These were the mysteries that nobody could solve, until the evidence started coming to light. This story actually begins not at the wedding, but months earlier. It begins with a successful real estate developer named Thomas Mitchell. He was 58 years old, respected in his community, wealthy and comfortable. But there was something missing from his life. His wife, Grace, had passed away 5 years before this story began. 5 years of mornings alone, 5 years of dinners that were too quiet, 5 years of a bed that felt too big, a house that felt too empty, a life that felt incomplete. Thomas had thrown himself into his work. He built his reputation. He accumulated his wealth. But success, as it turns out, cannot keep you warm on a cold night. That's when he met Monica. She appeared in his life like something out of a dream. She was elegant, poised, and refreshingly different from the other women he'd encountered. She listened when he talked. She laughed at his jokes. She seemed genuinely interested in who he was and what he'd built. She introduced herself as a luxury event planner, successful in her own right, independent, and not looking for anything except genuine connection. To Thomas, she seemed too good to be true, and honestly, his friends told him the same thing. But Thomas was lonely. Thomas was 60, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life alone. So he chose to ignore the small voice of warning in his mind. He chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten lucky. But there was someone else in Thomas's life who noticed things differently, someone whose instincts were sharper, whose suspicions emerged earlier than anyone else's. That person was Victoria, his daughter. Victoria was 27 years old. She was close to her father, but more importantly, she was incredibly close to her mother's memory. She had been there when her mother passed. She had held her father through the darkest days of grief. In some ways, Victoria had become her father's emotional anchor, his reminder of better days, his connection to the woman he'd loved so deeply. When her father introduced Victoria to Monica at a dinner 3 months before the wedding, something in Victoria's gut told her something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. Monica said all the right things. She wore the right clothes. She had the right job, the right background, the right resume. But in that first conversation, Victoria noticed something else. She noticed Monica's eyes. She noticed how Monica never actually made eye contact with Thomas when she was speaking. She noticed how Monica's smile changed, depending on who was watching. She noticed how when Thomas got up to use the bathroom, Monica's entire demeanor shifted. Her shoulders relaxed. Her expression hardened. For just a few seconds, before she caught herself and pulled the mask back on, Victoria saw something different. She saw someone calculating, someone working, someone performing. Over the next 2 months, Victoria paid attention. She watched Monica during family dinners. She listened to her stories. She noted the inconsistencies. Monica claimed she was planning events across the country, yet Victoria noticed that Monica's phone never rang. Monica spoke about her successful business, yet Victoria never saw her checking emails or responding to clients. Monica mentioned trips she'd taken, events she'd coordinated, but when Victoria tried to verify these stories through mutual acquaintances, the stories fell apart. The events didn't exist. The clients didn't remember her. The trips weren't logged anywhere. More alarming, Victoria began noticing how Monica's questions about Thomas's business were never casual. They were specific. They targeted information about his company's finances, his employees, his business partners, his account information, and his holdings. Monica asked these questions in gentle ways, disguised as concern or interest, but they were always fishing for details. Victoria started keeping notes. She started paying attention to dates and times. She watched as Monica encouraged Thomas to introduce her to his business associates, his accountants, his lawyers. She watched as Monica suggested that Thomas might want to consolidate his finances or discuss estate planning before the wedding. She watched as Monica asked to meet with Thomas's longtime accountant, Daniel Forbes, repeatedly, claiming she wanted to understand Thomas's financial situation so she could plan their future together properly. Then came the moment that changed everything. Victoria was at her father's house, and she needed to print something from the office. She noticed Monica's laptop was open on the desk. Victoria shouldn't have looked. She knew it was wrong, but something compelled her. She opened the screen, and what she found made her blood run cold. Email drafts, dozens of them. And they weren't from Monica. They were written to Monica, from an email account she didn't recognize. The emails discussed transfer dates, account numbers, access codes, and something called Operation Transition. They discussed how the ceremony is the final step, and once the documents are signed, we begin Phase 2. Victoria's hands were shaking. She took a screenshot, then another. Then she did something that might have been illegal, might have been wrong, but that she felt was necessary. She contacted a friend who worked in cybersecurity, and together, they dug deeper. What they uncovered over the next week was almost too much to comprehend. Monica wasn't even her real name. Her actual name was Stephanie Russo, and she had a history that included connections to a fraud network that had been operating for nearly a decade. Victoria learned that Stephanie Russo had targeted at least 6 wealthy widowers in the past 8 years. 6 men, 6 successful professionals who'd lost their spouses and were vulnerable. The pattern was identical each time. Identify the target, create a false persona, gain their trust, propose marriage. Then, after the wedding, begin systematically transferring assets to offshore accounts. But Stephanie never worked alone. Every operation had a team behind it. In Thomas's case, the team included Daniel Forbes, his own accountant, and another man named Marcus Chen, who posed as an immigration attorney and helped coordinate the financial transfers and documentation. There were others too, people operating behind the scenes, watching, waiting, documenting everything. It was a sophisticated operation. It was professional. It was ruthless. Victoria realized that if she didn't act, if she didn't stop this wedding, her father would lose not just his money, but potentially everything. She would lose her father in a different way, to heartbreak, shame, and betrayal. Victoria made the hardest decision of her life. She decided to stop the wedding. Not by quietly speaking to her father. No, because Victoria knew that Stephanie had manipulated her father so completely, had woven such an intricate web of lies and false affection that he would never believe her if she just told him. She knew he would demand proof. He would be defensive. He would accuse her of being jealous or threatened. Instead, Victoria gathered all of her evidence: the emails, the financial records, the background checks, the connections to the fraud network, and she decided to expose it all during the wedding ceremony itself. It was a desperate move. It was a public humiliation. It was the nuclear option. But Victoria believed it was the only option that would truly save her father, because sometimes the truth is so massive, so shocking, so undeniable, that it has to hit you all at once. It has to stun you into seeing clearly what you've been too blinded by love to see before. The wedding day arrived. The guests filtered into the church. Thomas stood at the altar in his tuxedo, nervously adjusting his boutonniere. The music began. Everyone stood. Stephanie appeared in the doorway in a white wedding dress, looking every inch the bride. She looked beautiful. She looked innocent. She looked completely convincing. Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he watched her walk toward him. But then, just as Stephanie reached the altar, just as the pastor opened his mouth to begin the ceremony, the church doors burst open. Victoria walked in, and in her hands she held a tablet. She was walking with such purpose, such determination, that the entire congregation fell silent. The pastor looked confused. The guests gasped. Thomas's face registered shock. And Stephanie? Stephanie's face went completely pale. Victoria stood between her father and his bride, and without saying a word, she turned on the tablet and hit play. And what followed over the next 5 minutes was a presentation of evidence so clear, so damaging, so absolutely incontrovertible, that by the end of it, Stephanie had already turned and was running for an exit. The emails played, the financial records displayed, the background information revealed, and as each piece of evidence unfolded, Thomas aged in real time. His face went from confusion to disbelief to horror to heartbreak. Victoria had already contacted the police before the ceremony. They were waiting outside the church. As Stephanie tried to flee, federal agents blocked the exits. They arrested her right there in her wedding dress. They also arrested Daniel Forbes, who was in the congregation. Marcus Chen was arrested 2 days later trying to board a flight to China. The church erupted into chaos. Guests were being questioned. Police cordoned off the building as a crime scene. Investigators began collecting evidence, and Thomas sat in a front pew, his face in his hands, trying to process the fact that the woman he had almost married was a criminal, that his own accountant, someone he'd trusted for 15 years, was part of an organized fraud network, that his daughter, the daughter he'd been worried about, had been his savior all along. Within 48 hours, Stephanie Russo had been charged with fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and conspiracy. Daniel Forbes had been charged as a co-conspirator. The investigation expanded. Federal agents discovered that this network extended far beyond Thomas. They identified other victims. They uncovered more schemes. This wasn't just a single case of romantic fraud. This was a coordinated criminal enterprise. As authorities dug deeper, they discovered just how calculated everything had been. Stephanie's entire identity was fake. Her background was fabricated. Her job didn't exist. Her credentials were forged. But more than that, investigators found evidence that suggested there was someone higher up in the organization, someone orchestrating these operations, someone who was directing Stephanie and the others like puppets on strings. The investigation led to a man named Vincent Moretti, a known associate of organized crime, operating out of New Jersey. Moretti had created what he called a romantic investment scheme. He targeted wealthy men through social media, through online dating sites, through various digital channels. He researched their finances, their vulnerabilities, their emotional weaknesses. Then he selected the perfect con artists from his network to match with them. Stephanie Russo had been one of his most successful operatives. Over 8 years, she had targeted 12 separate men. 12. She had attempted to marry at least 8 of them. Of those 8, she had successfully married 3. Combined with her partners, she and the network had stolen nearly $4 million. But more than the money, they had stolen time, trust, and hope from people who simply wanted to be loved. What happened next revealed Victoria's true character. Rather than stepping back, rather than feeling satisfied that she'd saved her father and exposed the criminals, Victoria became an advocate. She worked with federal investigators. She provided additional evidence. She connected them with other potential victims. She began documenting the entire case so it could be used in court. And most importantly, she forgave her father. Because Thomas carried an enormous weight of shame. He felt foolish. He felt embarrassed. He felt like he'd betrayed his late wife's memory. But Victoria reminded him that what happened to him wasn't weakness. It was the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation by professionals trained to exploit human vulnerability. Victoria also did something unexpected. She reached out to one of Stephanie's previous victims, a man named Gerald Patterson, who had been targeted 3 years earlier in a similar scheme that fell apart just weeks before his wedding. Gerald had never told anyone what happened. He'd lived with the shame in silence. Victoria convinced him to come forward. Together, they began building a support network for victims of romance fraud and financial crime. Victoria testified in court against Stephanie Russo, Daniel Forbes, and Marcus Chen. She testified with calm clarity, walking the jury through the evidence, explaining how each piece fit together to form a comprehensive picture of fraud and manipulation. Stephanie Russo was convicted on 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She received 9 years in federal prison. Daniel Forbes received 5 years. Marcus Chen received 6 years and was ordered to pay restitution to his victims. Vincent Moretti was arrested 6 months later in a separate operation. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. But here's where the story takes on a different meaning. On the day Stephanie was sentenced, she finally admitted the truth. She admitted that she'd been recruited into this life when she was desperate, when she was broke, when she was vulnerable. She admitted that Moretti had groomed her, had trained her, had forced her into this life through a combination of financial desperation and psychological manipulation. She admitted that she had started with lower-stakes operations and had been gradually moved into more serious cons. She admitted that what she'd done to Thomas and the other men had profoundly damaged her own ability to feel genuine human connection. She admitted that she was, in many ways, also a victim of the system that created her. Her admission didn't excuse her actions, but it did provide context. It did open people's eyes to the reality that organized fraud networks don't just happen. They're built. They're cultivated. They exploit human weakness on both sides of the crime. After the trials concluded, Thomas Mitchell made a decision that surprised many people. He stepped back from his real estate business. He sold his company to his management team and used the proceeds to establish the Mitchell Foundation for Fraud Victim Recovery. The foundation provides financial assistance, legal aid, and psychological counseling to people who have been victims of financial crime, romance fraud, and organized scams. Thomas also became a public speaker. He began appearing at conferences, at universities, at community centers, sharing his story. He talked about what it felt like to be manipulated. He talked about the shame, the embarrassment, the feeling of stupidity that came afterward. He talked about how important it is for victims to understand that they were targeted by professionals, that their vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was humanity. Victoria, meanwhile, expanded her work. She founded the Trust Again Initiative, an organization dedicated to helping victims of romance fraud rebuild their lives and their ability to trust others. She conducted workshops. She trained law enforcement officers about the psychology of romance fraud. She connected victims with support networks and resources. And most importantly, she helped other daughters, other sons, other family members recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation so they could intervene before it was too late. Now, as we reach the end of this story, I want you to think about something. Victoria made a decision to publicly humiliate her father in order to save him. It was a desperate measure taken by someone who felt she had no other options. And it worked. Her father's eyes were opened. The criminal network was exposed. Victims were protected. But was it the right approach? What would you have done in Victoria's position? Would you have found a more private way to tell your father? Would you have gone directly to the police and let them handle it? Or would you have done exactly what Victoria did? And here's another question. Do you think Thomas handled his crisis with wisdom? He could have retreated into shame. He could have blamed others. He could have spent years feeling victimized. Instead, he transformed his pain into purpose. He created resources to help others. He became a voice for victims. Was this the most important part of the story? The justice, or the recovery, the legal victory, or the personal transformation? Think about how you would handle being betrayed in such a profound way. Think about whether you'd be able to forgive not just the person who betrayed you, but yourself for being vulnerable to that betrayal. The remarkable thing about this story is that it reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. We are all vulnerable to deception. We are all capable of being fooled, not because we're stupid, not because we're weak, but because we're human, because we have the capacity to love, and love makes us vulnerable. Romance fraud networks like the one run by Vincent Moretti understand this. They exploit it. They weaponize human connection against us. They turn the very thing that makes us beautiful, our ability to hope, to trust, to believe in the possibility of love, into the thing that makes us exploitable. But here's what the story of Thomas and Victoria also reveals. Our vulnerability can be transformed into strength. Our pain can be transformed into purpose. Our betrayal can be transformed into a tool for protecting others. Thomas was manipulated by a professional con artist, but his daughter was more perceptive. His daughter was more cautious. His daughter was more willing to trust her instincts, even when it meant going against her father's desires. And in the end, it was family. It was love. It was the deep bond between a father and daughter that broke through years of elaborate lies and manipulation. That's the real victory in this story, not the convictions, not the sentencing, not the legal victory. The victory is that love defeated calculated deception. The victory is that family remained intact. The victory is that the truth, however shocking and however painful, ultimately set them free. So here's what I want to know from you. If you were in Victoria's shoes, if you suspected your parent was being manipulated by someone they loved, what would you do? Would you have the courage to be the voice of truth? Or would you stay silent to protect their feelings? And if you were Thomas, if you discovered you'd been so completely deceived by someone you trusted, how would you move forward? Would you close yourself off from love? Or would you, like Thomas, recognize that the problem wasn't love itself, but the predators who exploit it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you think about this story. Tell us what you would have done. We genuinely read every single comment, and your perspectives matter to us. If this story resonated with you, if it moved you, if it made you think about the importance of trusting your instincts and the people you love, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone you care about. Send it to that family member who tends to be trusting, who might benefit from understanding that predators exist. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel right now, because we have more stories coming. Stories about people who've overcome betrayal. Stories about justice being served. Stories about human resilience. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about real stories with real consequences. I'll see you in the next one.